All right. Okay, we are online. Okay, so welcome everyone to this next an optimal seminar series. And today it's our pleasure to host Eilyan Bitar, who's a professor in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Cornell University. Eilyan's research is focused on the optimization control economics of power systems and transportation systems. He received his bachelor degree and PhD degree from University of Berkeley. He then was a postdoctoral fellow at the California Institute of Technology and UC Berkeley, and then he joined Cornell University as a professor. And is a recipient of many prestigious awards. Among them is a range of faculty fellowships and NSF Faculty Early Career Development Award Career. Thank you, Eilyan, for agreeing to give your talk today. It's a great pleasure. Please feel free to ask your questions directly by muting yourself or dropping them in the chat, and I will pass them on to Eilyan as we go. So welcome, Eilyan.
Thank you, Vlad. It's an honor to be here. And I want to reiterate what Vlad just said. Please feel free to interrupt me at any point in the talk. You know, I prefer for this to be more interactive, so don't be shy. So just to kind of dive right in, today I'll be describing some experimental results that are a result of a pilot study that we had helped develop and deploy over the last couple of years, primarily during the pandemic, actually, is when it was operating. And the focus there is coordination of residential electric vehicle charging. How do you harness the underlying flexibility in people's charging preferences to optimize for a variety of grid objectives? So I'll talk about some of the steps involved in developing the pilot, the details behind the design of the coordination mechanism, and some insights that we're able to gain through this work that I think will help inform research in this area moving forward. Okay. I should also say this is based on the work of my PhD student Paulina Alexinko. You know, none of this would have been possible without her incredible work. So all of the thanks goes to her in terms of the results that we're able to deliver as part of this research. So this is just an outline. I'll talk a little bit about just background, motivation for why we did this work. Then I'll describe some of the pilot parameters at a high level. And then I'll describe some of the empirical insights that we were able to gain from this pilot. And I'll close with a brief discussion of ongoing research and what I think are interesting directions moving forward. I should also say that this is beyond kind of the joint work with my PhD student. None of this would have been possible without the efforts of multiple stakeholders, including the New York State Department of Public Service, New York State Electric and Gas, and NYSERDA, which is a research authority in New York State focused on energy and energy efficiency, as well as NSF. So the primary motivation is that electric vehicles are coming. Okay, although the current penetration rate is quite low, I think less than 2% of all cars on the road in the United States today are plug-in electric. The rate of adoption is growing very rapidly. Okay, and this is driven by a number of things: progressive policies at the federal and state level. The California has pledged to ban the sale of all new gas and diesel-powered vehicles by 2035. Other states have kind of made similar commitments. Automakers are investing heavily. GM has pledged to completely phase out its gas and diesel powered vehicles by 2035, Volvo by 2030. And much of this is being driven by kind of declining costs. Okay, the price of per kilowatt hour of a battery pack has dropped precipitously over the last 7 or 8 years to such an extent that EVs are likely to reach price parity with more conventional gas power counterparts by in the next 4 or 5 years. And one of the kind of another kind of, I think, important motivation for this transition is climate change. Okay, the desire to reduce the greenhouse gas emission intensity of the transportation sector. Okay, so if you electrify cars and you supply electricity from clean renewable energy resources, then you can displace up to 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions produced in this country. Okay, assuming the electricity supply is clean. There are also kind of corollary benefits associated with the possibility of leveraging on electric vehicles as small batteries to help support the integration of renewables in a way that kind of allows EVs to balance their intermittency. And so this convergence is also crucial in terms of being able to support the integration of renewables. So with all this being said, there's a very important question that needs to be answered. Is the power grid ready, okay, in the near term to accommodate the increase in electricity demand that's going to be driven by the transition to electric vehicles? And the answer to this is a little bit nuanced. In short, no, the grid is not prepared, but it's not to say that there isn't sufficient capacity at the bulk transmission and generation level. It's the grid edge, it's the infrastructure at the edge of the power system, and the distribution networks that's going to bind initially. So think secondary and primary transformers. Okay, these have limited capacity in terms of their ability to serve demand. They were designed to serve more traditional demand profiles that correspond to households that have peak loads on the order of 2 to 3 kilowatts, right? As we transition to electric vehicles and the use of more powerful chargers, namely level 2 chargers at the residential level, you'll see a sharp increase in the peak demand at the residential level. So here I've just provided some numbers. Level 2 chargers, their capacity can range anywhere from 7 to 19 kilowatts. They cost anywhere from $5,000 to $2,000 to install, depending on the infrastructure available at the home. So if you think about someone with, let's say, a 7 kilowatt charger, using that to charge their electric vehicle, typically charging happens overnight. So when people come home, plug their vehicle in to be charged, well, that increase in load or power being drawn by the charger is going to coincide with the typical household peak in the evening. And so you're going to increase that peak 3 or 4-fold, okay? So to see why this may cause problems for the distribution network, I've provided some specific numbers from New York State Electric and Gas. This is where we actually deployed the pilot. So a secondary distribution transformer is typically sized at around 25 kilowatts or kilovolt amperes. And those are typically designed to serve 5 to 10 households. Okay. So these numbers, if you assume that each household has an average peak of 2 kilowatts, you can immediately see that the installation of 1 to 2 level 2 chargers below that transformer is going to cause an exceedance. Okay. And that can result in dramatic transformer aging, overloads. The transformers can explode, causing other downstream or upstream effects, depending on how you view it in the distribution network. There was even an article recently in the New York Times outlining one of these events where someone had installed had plugged in their new Tesla to charge. It was the only EV on the block, and the transformer blew. So if we think about dollars and cents, what does it cost to upgrade the infrastructure? Well, if you're going to increase the capacity from 25 to 75 kilowatts, well, you're talking about an expense that ranges, including kind of the infrastructure and the installation, anywhere from $14,000 to $24,000 a piece. Okay, so if you're replacing hundreds to thousands of transformers within a service area, well, that adds up very quickly. So then a natural question to ask is, well, can we make do with the existing infrastructure? Okay, and that's the kind of the goal of one of the primary goals that one of the questions that we set out to answer with this pilot. So what I'll do now is I'll describe the pilot study and our approach to addressing some of these questions through its design, and then I'll describe some of the results that we were able to extract through this work. But before I move on, are there any questions as it relates to the high-level motivation or any of the specific numbers that I've shared? Okay, so this is just a fun slide. It shows, so the pilot was called OptimizEV, and it was operating within Tompkins County, New York. That's where Cornell sits. It's that part of the distribution network is managed by NYSEG. And these pictures here illustrate some of the advertising that we use throughout the city to recruit customers for the pilot. So it's kind of fun to see some of our research kind of on the side of a bus. It's the first time that's a first for me. So like I said, this was in collaboration with NYSEG. We recruited 34 customers to participate. Customers were recruited on a first come, first served basis. So it wasn't randomized. And each customer that was enrolled in this program received a free level 2 charger with a rated capacity of 7.7 kilowatts. The pilot ran from January 1st, 2020, all the way to May 31st, 2021, so around 17 months. The pilot was broken up into 2 phases. The first phase was focused on baseline data collection, so trying to understand what the baseline unmanaged charging patterns look like and what customers' baseline preferences were before we introduced our intervention. And this was followed by the second phase, where we deployed our incentive and coordination mechanism over the span of 15 months to assess its effect. Now, you'll notice that the pilot began just before the lockdowns. Okay, so the COVID-19 restrictions that were put in place in terms of lockdown and the gradual reopening of our economy did manifest themselves in the kinds of behaviors that we observed over the course of the pilot. So I'll talk about those as well. Just a high-level number. So over the span of this 17-month pilot, we delivered over 62 megawatt hours of energy to customers, and that's roughly equivalent to 186,000 miles, vehicle miles traveled. So if you kind of divide that by the number of participants, that's roughly 5,000 miles per year. So that's typically what you expect to see in Tompkins County in terms of distance traveled. So the high-level objectives were the following. One, our goal was to kind of quantify and assess the impacts of unmanaged charging on the local distribution network. Using kind of data reflecting kind of individual user transportation patterns or charging patterns at their home, we also wanted to assess what the latent flexibility in charging demand was. To what extent are these loads flexible and can they be reshaped? And then finally, given an estimate of that flexibility, we examined the extent to which we could extract that flexibility for coordination through the incentive and control mechanism that I'll describe later in the talk. Okay. And of course, one of the goals of this pilot was to assess the extent to which these mechanisms were effective over time in maintaining customer participation. So I'll talk about that as well. So let's kind of look at some of the phase 1 data, okay, as it relates to the unmanaged charging patterns. So what I've plotted here in this figure is kind of baseline electricity demand, so non-electric vehicle demand. This is based on data taken from the distribution circuit and one of the residential distribution circuits in Tompkins County. We scaled it down so that it reflects roughly 50 to 60 households. The phase 1 charging data shows that users typically plug in, okay, on average between 5 and 7 p.m. and typically unplug between 7 and 9 a.m. the following morning, okay? And that's reflected in these plug-in time and unplug time distributions that I've plotted here. And so what you can probably anticipate is that, well, if people are plugging in, right, when baseline demand is typically peaking, you're already seeing amplification of that baseline demand. And indeed, the data does show that. So each one of these slivers here represents the demand associated with a single electric vehicle pilot on a particular day. Actually, I forget what day this is. I think this was probably late February. What you see is there's a substantial amplification of peak demand. But I think what's even more important to maybe see from this plot, or to take away from this plot, is that although the arrival times or the plug-in times tend to coincide with peak load hours, the times at which people finish charging typically happen much earlier than their departure unplug times, okay? And so these cars finish charging typically within 3 or 4 hours and remain plugged in for the rest of the night, essentially doing nothing, okay? And so if we plot the distribution of charging completion times, you see that, right? So users typically finish charging in 4 hours and have roughly 8 or 9 hours of extra time where they're just sitting plugged in doing nothing. So it's natural to ask, well, how do you leverage on this flexibility? Because if you had the ability to shift these loads within that window, well, you could potentially avoid some of these negative effects associated with peak load amplification. So there are a number of challenges that one encounters in trying to accomplish this, right? First is, flexibility is private information, right, of the users or the customers. So you need to incentivize, you need to give them incentives to reveal that information to the utility or some coordinating authority. The second is, well, in order to incentivize flexibility, you need to clearly define what you mean by flexibility. So I'll describe so I'll do that sequentially. I'll first describe our specific notion of flexibility, and then I'll describe the incentive mechanism. So in order to define flexibility associated with a charging request, we have to define what we mean by a charging request or charging session. So charging sessions, we parameterize by 3 numbers: the desired energy, so how much extra energy you need when plugging in, the duration of time that you're plugged in, which we call completion deadline, okay, and your maximum charging rate. Now, even though customers had different, all had identical chargers, which were rated at 7.7 kilowatts, the differences in their vehicles sometimes result in kind of smaller maximum rates because of low-level battery control constraints. And so the way we kind of measure flexibility using this characterization of a charging session is what's known as slack time or laxity, as it's more commonly known in the queuing literature. And laxity or slack time is defined as the difference between the minimum amount of time that it would take to charge your vehicle if you started charging at your maximum rate as soon as you plug in. So that's given by your energy requirement divided by your maximum rate, and the duration of time that you're plugged in. Okay. So the natural way to think about slack time is that's the extra amount of time that you're plugged in after having completed charging had you charged at your maximum rate upon arrival. It's also proportional to the peak load reduction achievable when charging at the minimum rate possible over your charging window, as defined by this duration D. Okay, so here's an example of a charging request with 0 slack time. Okay, so an energy requirement of 20 kilowatt hours, a maximum rate of 5 kilowatts. Well, if the deadline is 4 hours, you have to charge at the maximum rate in order to supply that energy within the deadline. If we increase the deadline to 10 hours, right, that results in a laxity of 6 hours, right, or slack time of 6 hours. And so one thing that you could do is you could just shift, right, the time at which this vehicle starts charging. So this is an example of a shifted charging profile, while still ensuring that you complete charging by the deadline. Another option is to charge at the minimum rate, right? Possible, the minimum constant rate possible. In this case, that would be 2 kilowatts. But more importantly, right, these requirements, when you have flexibility in this way, give rise to a continuum of power profiles that could be supplied to this vehicle while still ensuring that its charging requirements are met. And so another possibility would be to use a time varying charging profile. Okay, so this is just a synthetic example to illustrate the differences in charging profiles that could be used to meet these charging requirements. Well, the charging demand within the flexibility suggested by its deadline and rate constraint and energy requirement. So the basic premise behind the incentives we use to extract flexibility from customers is known as slack differentiated pricing. Okay. And so we were essentially providing, so customers were paying a flat rate for electricity, something on the order of, 10 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So if they provide zero flexibility, they receive no discount. If they provide increased flexibility in the form of slack time, we give them a discount that's proportional to $1 per kilowatt hour discount that's proportional to the slack time that they provide, up to a maximum slack time of 10 hours, at which point the discount saturates at 4.3 cents per kilowatt hour, okay? And the reason we use this specific number, 4.3 cents, is because this number reflects the utility's existing delivery rate. It's the component of your electricity price that reflects infrastructure costs. And so that was a requirement that the utility imposed upon us in terms of how we were able to provide discounts to customers. And so if you provide a charging request that has laxity S, you receive a discount, which is the discount price, P of S, times your energy request, okay? If you provide no laxity, you receive a zero discount. If you provide laxity of 10 hours, well, you get the maximum discount price. And really, there's no incentive for customers to provide flexibility or slack beyond the 10-hour max.
And just a quick question. What is the income level of those communities that you run your pilot with? Like, yes, how sensitive these bills for their monthly expenses?
Well, so that's a good question. We do not have socioeconomic information on the individual pilot participants. It may be possible to extract. We do, however, have a mix of participants, some of which are kind of employees of Cornell. But I think the more important thing to realize is that many of these people have electric vehicles, right? That was a prerequisite in order to participate in this pilot. So that's a clear indication of they're having excess income to the extent that they're able to pay more for a vehicle, right? In comparison with the gas or diesel powered counterparts. So I think the point you're making, I think, about whether or not this is sufficient to actually engender change, or whether or not there's even a meaningful discount is a good one. And I'll touch on that at the end of the talk. Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay, so let me talk about the user interface. So customers have to, every time they plug their vehicle in to be charged, they have to initiate a charging request. And that's done through a user interface on their smartphone or computer. I think all users used their smartphones. So when plugging in, right, they have to declare their current state of charge, their desired state of charge, okay, and when they want their charging completed by, okay, their deadline. So these three numbers, they can be specified on a session-by-session basis, or they can be customized, or they could be set as defaults. So a customer could set these at the beginning of the month and then kind of just forget and just plug in and press start charging, and they would be guaranteed to receive their energy by their stated or default preferences. But given all of the preferences that customers provide to the system through this interface, the utility can then use that flexibility, if it's received any, to optimally coordinate how the various the vehicles that are being actively charged to minimize peak demand, for example. And users, I think it's also important to say that they can opt out at any time. So mid-session, they can, if there's an emergency or they need their vehicle charged immediately, they can immediately switch to unmanaged charging, at which point their rate would increase to the maximum level. Okay, so that's the user interface. It's a little bit clunky, but we're, I think, it's a small scale pilot. I think if we were to scale up to a much larger pilot, this would need to be streamlined, but the basic features are there. So let me just talk a little bit about now the scheduling algorithm. So once you have flexibility from customers, once customers have agreed to participate in managed charging sessions, what do you do with that flexibility? So I'll describe the charging model that we use in our optimization algorithm. So we'll let N, capital N, be the set of vehicles being charged. Well, T here is the optimization horizon, which really is 24 hours, but because we're adjusting the charging rate on a minute-by-minute basis, the number of control intervals here, discrete time, 1,440, okay? Every charging request is described by the following tuple, okay? The arrival time, okay, the time at which a vehicle plugs in and initiates a charging session, the departure time, okay, the requested energy, and the maximum charging rate. I will let little Ri of t represent the charging profile associated with or the charging power level associated with vehicle I at time t. Okay, so the sequence of these numbers represents the charging profile associated with that particular vehicle. So each vehicle's charging profile has to satisfy some basic requirements. One, right, it needs to supply the desired energy over the charging window. Okay, so between the arrival and departure time, you have to deliver, okay, the requested energy, EI. You're not allowed to charge outside of that window. Okay, so the charging rates have to be 0 outside of the window. And so these are kind of standard charging requirements. You also have to ensure that your charging does not exceed the maximum charging rate. But more interestingly, there's a minimum non-zero charging rate imposed by the control protocol that's used to allow for controlled charging via the electric vehicle charging station. It's the J1772 charging protocol. And that enforces a minimum non-zero rate of 1.4 kilowatts. Okay, so you cannot, your smallest non-zero charging rate cannot be below this minimum level. It can be 0, but now this introduces a disjunctive constraint. Okay, which ultimately will give rise to a mixed integer quadratic formulation for the optimization problem that needs to be solved. So the objective or the optimization criterion that we're using to generate these charging profiles is essentially, you can think of it as a valley filling criterion. It's a criterion that it kind of will generate charging profiles that attempt to fill the valley of the baseline profile to the maximum extent possible. And so what we're minimizing is the sum of the squared baseline non-EV load plus the unmanaged EV load and the managed load that we can control. Okay, so here we're using a quadratic convex quadratic objective, but really any strictly convex objective would do. Okay, now I want to emphasize here, L of t, it's the combination of the non-EV load and the unmanaged load. And so because there's uncertainty in what the unmanaged load is going to be over the optimization horizon, we take a somewhat myopic approach and only use the unmanaged load associated with vehicles that are currently charging. Okay, so we're not actually incorporating the possibility of new arrivals, okay, that would correspond to unmanaged charging sessions. So you can think of this as a somewhat greedy or myopic approach that's being taken. It was done for simplicity, but it can result in suboptimal performance that I'll talk about later in towards the end of the talk. Because this is a mixed integer quadratic program, and we have a fixed time budget, right, to generate these charging profiles, less than a minute, but really actually less than 25 seconds because of the additional time that's needed to communicate back and forth between all of the individual resources involved in this system. We use a relax and round approach where we relax this disjunctive constraint to a continuous interval, okay? And then we round our solutions in a certain way that they're guaranteed to generate feasible solutions for the original problem. This is suboptimal, okay, but it works quite well, but can sometimes lead to inefficiencies, which you'll see in the data that I'll present. Okay, now you can think of this as the Oracle optimal scheduling problem, right? This is the optimization problem that you would solve had you kind of perfect information about arrivals and departures over your horizon. The reality is you don't, right? And there are things that are changing about your system. And so what we do is at each time t, every minute, we resolve this optimization problem using kind of the most recent information about kind of baseline load, current charging requests, both managed and unmanaged, and yeah, so those are the primary kind of things that are changing, at least as it relates to the optimization that we solve. So the only difference really here is that we replace the energy request with the residual energy requirement at time t. So this is the remaining energy to be delivered after having delivered some increment to that resource, that EV, over the initial segment of its charging window. And here N of t represents the set of active charging vehicles at time t, and this changes over time. But again, I want to emphasize in this approach, we're not anticipating the potential impact that future arrivals might have on decisions we're taking now. So this is purely myopic in that sense, okay? So what we do is, this is kind of a standard model predictive control approach or certainty equivalent approach to scheduling. We generate a charging profile for each active EV spanning the next capital T time periods. Okay. We transmit that to each EV. The EV attempts to execute the first input as closely as possible. Okay. It then transmits the actual power that it was able to draw, which may deviate from this input, right? And then we use that to update the residual charging requirement, and then we resolve at t+1. Okay. So this optimization is being solved on a regular basis every minute. That also has costs associated with it, which I'll touch on in a moment. So what are some of the practical issues that we encountered here as it relates to this kind of approach to scheduling? One is, like I mentioned, it's myopic, right? And so we're not anticipating kind of the effect of future arrivals on the potential impact they might have on kind of the optimal decisions that one might take at the current time. So for instance, if you know that there are going to be a number of unmanaged charging sessions that are going to happen, within the valley of the baseline peak load, well, you may want to increase the charging rates of some of your managed sessions at the current time so that you don't coincide with that peak that may occur later in your optimization horizon. Second, because we're resolving on a minute-by-minute basis, we're communicating over a cellular network every minute, and that also has costs associated in terms of the data that needs to be transmitted back and forth. And so a more natural approach might be to take a more event-driven approach to scheduling, where you only update the charging profiles when there's a change in your network, right? A new arrival or departure or an appreciable change in your baseline load profile forecasts. I should also say that there are significant errors on occasion between the commands that we send to the EVs and what they're able to execute. That's driven primarily by two things. Okay. One, we're asking customers to provide their initial state of charge, okay? And that's something they're reading off their dash, which is noisy. They also use default preferences, and oftentimes those default preferences can be very different from their actual state of charge on a day-to-day basis. And so what can end up happening is something like I've shown in this figure, where a customer says their state of charge is actually much lower than it is, right? And so you generate a charging profile there. So the red here is the charging command, and the blue curve is the actual power drawn. And so they're tracking relatively closely until the vehicle reaches its maximum state of charge, at which point the charging commands begin to the charging response begins to deviate. And because you still think there's residual energy, right, the energy requirement from the battery, you increase your charging command, okay, resulting in this deviation. So this is really an artifact of kind of the non-adaptive nature of the scheduling algorithm that we used. You could do something more sophisticated, or maybe you attempt to kind of learn online what the state of charge is based on the response you see from the charging references, right? So the actual charging power drawn by the vehicle. The second thing has to do with kind of the kind of idiosyncratic charging tail characteristics that different EVs have, because different EVs have different voltage control mechanisms at the battery level to kind of maximize or maintain battery lifetime. That typically manifests itself as a decreasing maximum rate as you approach maximum state of charge. That's what I've kind of plotted here for one of the EVs in our pilot. And those vary from vehicle to vehicle. They can vary widely. And those can actually affect your performance in the way that I've described in terms of these reference tracking errors. So that's a potential another opportunity to improve efficiency, where one attempts to maybe learn these idiosyncratic charging characteristics on the fly, okay, on a vehicle-to-vehicle basis. Okay. And I'll say one more thing. Okay, these are all kind of very practical issues, but I think they're important. Because we're controlling the vehicle using the charging station, that J1772 charging protocol does not require the vehicle to share state of charge information. And that's why we actually need the user to input that data. So that's just an artifact of that protocol. It should change. Okay, so let me describe some of the data now that we collected after having deployed this incentive and control mechanism during the second phase. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to compare three different scenarios. Okay, unmanaged charging, okay, which is simulated because this phase, the second phase, was corresponded to our use of optimized charging. And the way we simulate unmanaged charging is that we use the arrival and departure and charging requirements associated with every charging session during the second phase, and we generate an unmanaged session for each one of those sessions that corresponds to that vehicle charging at its maximum rate as soon as it plugs in. Okay, so that's a very natural estimate or simulation of what unmanaged charging would have looked like had we not intervened. We also compare our approach to time of use-based pricing mechanisms. So you can, these are kind of tariffs where the price of electricity varies over the course of the day, typically at two levels: an on-peak price, which is high during on-peak hours, and an off-peak price, which is lower during nighttime hours. And so for this simulation, we used kind of NICEAG's time of use rate, which I believe had a transition from peak to off-peak at 11:30 p.m. or midnight, okay? So the way we simulate the response to time of use pricing signals is we take all the charging sessions from our experiment, we decompose them into opt-in sessions where customers decided to participate in managed charging. For those sessions, we generate a time of use session where the customer is assumed to the extent possible to delay their charging to the off-peak pricing period. Any demand that can't be satisfied during the off-peak pricing period is satisfied on peak, okay? And for all of the unmanaged or opt-out sessions, we treat them as such, as unmanaged charging sessions, okay? So we assume that users that did not respond to our incentives would not have responded to the time of use-based incentive. So to give us something, an apples to apples comparison, okay? So let's look at unmanaged charging. So this is for the week of March 9th to 13th, so just prior to the lockdowns in New York State. And you see what we would expect based on some of the initial data that I shared. The majority of charging happens on peak, resulting in a substantial amplification of peak demand with very little demand happening in the valley, the nighttime periods or hours. So something more interesting happens with time of use pricing. Okay, so the red charging profiles here correspond to EVs that are not responding to time of use pricing, and the blue charging profiles correspond to EVs that are. And what you see is that the common off-peak period among all of the tariffs that customers are seeing results in a synchronization of the charging patterns. Okay, so many of these EVs, although they had heterogeneous plug-in times when unmanaged, the effect of this common off-peak pricing period results in a synchronization which sharpens that demand, sometimes resulting in a peak that's larger than the peak that would have resulted had you not intervened, had you just let EVs charge in an unmanaged way. Okay. Now, this is primarily driven by the fact that these tariffs are required to be non-discriminatory. All customers are required to see the same rate. So one way to maybe solve or deal with this issue would be to charge different customers at different rates, maybe with different off-peak pricing periods, which might manifest in some smearing of this effect. But at least through our discussions with the Public Service Commission, that's was largely a non-starter. There are other tariffs that can address this issue to some extent, but because this is the most prevalent tariff that's being proposed, deployed today actually to deal with the impact of EV charging on distribution infrastructure, that's what we focused on in our analysis. And I should also say, the majority of the pricing mechanisms or dynamic pricing mechanisms that have been proposed in literature deal with this effect are either kind of iterative, requiring kind of dynamic engagement between the customer and the coordinating authority, which can sometimes require the customer to solve, relatively complex problems to determine what their optimal charging schedule should be, which is a lot to ask, I think, of most people participating in these kinds of programs. Or there are mechanisms which require customers to report their types, which, given then a collection of types, determine price, which, and a combination of schedules, which minimize some measure of social welfare or consumer surplus. Those are problematic because they introduce some form of price risk, right? Customers don't know prices prior to reporting their preferences, and there are a number of issues that associated with imposing price risk upon customers. So, okay, so are there any questions before I move on? Okay, so
just maybe not a question, but this is overwhelming results, to be honest, to see it. And I'm just curious, since this is a main mechanism to incentivize or disincentivize charging in the peak hours, what's your understanding? How come this effect could be overlooked, in the policy making?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One, the current penetration of EVs is quite low, right? And so, but you can see that on some days, right, even though there's a synchronizing effect on the EV charging demand, the peak is still reduced relative to the unmanaged peak that would have resulted, right? And actually, if you have a very small number of EVs on your network, you can quickly see that, you would have most of your load appearing in the nighttime valley. And these mechanisms can be effective. However, as penetration increases to levels that are maybe 5 to 10 years out, these mechanisms will begin to fail, okay, in this way. But this is recognized in the industry. This is known as a timer peak, actually. And so it's becoming a more prominent issue that utilities are seeking to address, okay? Also show some statistics which show that actually time of use pricing, can be effective, okay? So I don't want to say that it's unilaterally bad. Actually, I think is maybe a reasonable mechanism to use in the interim while we're developing more sophisticated approaches.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Okay, and so what I plotted here are the actual charging profiles that resulted through our coordination mechanism. So again, the red profiles correspond to unmanaged sessions. These are sessions where users opted out. They decided to charge at their maximum rate without delay. And the green sessions, or these green slivers, correspond to sessions that we generated based on the optimization algorithm that I described previously. And so what you can see is that, the majority of kind of the managed load is spread throughout the nighttime valley, although there are some opt-outs which happen on peak. You see kind of strange things happening occasionally. So for instance, here you can see that the load isn't evenly spread out, right, to the nighttime valley. And that's in part due to some of the uncertainties that I described on the earlier slide, which is related to charging responses that are different from the ideal charging response that's used in our model. It's also due in part to the relax and round approach we were using, okay, to solve to generate the charging profiles. It's somewhat nuanced, so if people are interested, I'm happy to kind of dive into some of those details with them offline. But to a large extent, the mechanism was quite effective. So what I plotted here are kind of statistics over the entire second phase of the pilot. Okay, load statistics. So the solid for each of these scenarios, okay, unmanaged, time of use pricing, and optimized charging. The solid lines here represent kind of the median EV load, Okay, the darkly shaded region is an interdecile range, an empirical interdecile range, and the lightly shaded region is the min-max range over all of the load realizations that we saw over the 15th month span of the second phase. So again, at least statistically, you can see the unmanaged charging is consistently amplifying kind of the baseline peak. Time of use pricing, load under time of use pricing is sharper. Okay, so you see, not only do you see these peaks happening in the middle of night, they're actually much sharper, right? And that can have other implications in terms of transient stability on your distribution network or power grid. If you have a step change in load, right, that can induce instabilities that can cause some resources on your grid to trip, causing either local brownouts or blackouts potentially. But going back to your question, Vlad, what you see here is the median load, right, is consistently below kind of the baseline peak. So actually, for the scenarios that we considered, time of use pricing, although on certain days did result in larger peaks, on average, or at least in terms of the median, was generating load profiles that were consistently below peak. Okay. And for optimized charging, again, you see that the load is kind of evenly spread throughout the nighttime valley. Okay. And it's much smoother, right, than the load that you would see under time of use pricing. I'll also say, some of you might be uneasy because this is a simulation. There's a wealth of data, actual experimental data, associated with coordinated charging via time of use pricing, and these kind of sharp increases in demand are clearly reflected in those data as well. Okay. Okay, we have these are load duration curves. I won't spend too much time talking about them beyond saying that unmanaged charging resulted in a 16% exceedance of the baseline peak, 40 hours over the course of phase 2 for 40 hours. Time of use pricing resulted in exceedance, 16% exceedance of roughly 8 hours, and optimized charging resulted in exceedance of on the order of 20 minutes. So several orders of magnitude decrease, or an order of magnitude decrease in terms of the duration that you're exceeding this threshold. And time of use pricing in the worst case resulted in a peak that is consistent with unmanaged charging in the worst case. Let's talk about charging preferences, okay, in the 10 minutes that I have left. I'll try to keep it to 5 minutes if there are any questions at the end that people want to ask. There's time. So, customers do opt out. Actually, the opt-out rate over the course of the pilot was roughly was on average 35%, okay? So 35% of the time among all phase 2 sessions, customers opted out, okay? So it's natural to ask why. So what I've plotted here, I think this figure is very informative. I've plotted each one of these dots corresponds to a charging session, okay, that occurred during phase 2, okay? And it represents the session start time and session end time. Okay, so when somebody plugged in and when they unplugged, not when they finished charging, but when they unplugged to depart for their next trip. And so what you can see here is that there's a natural clustering. Even without looking at this plot, you would ask yourself, well, what would charging sessions kind of roughly kind of cluster according to, right? Given what you would expect people to charge like. And they naturally cluster into two types of charging sessions. Long overnight sessions when people plug in the evening and leave their vehicle plugged in until they depart for work the following day. So that corresponds to this kind of cluster of points here, right? So if we look at the y-axis, which is session start time, people plugging in the evening around between 3 and 7 p.m. would correspond to this kind of range of plug-in times. And a departure in the following morning, right, between 7 and 9 a.m. would correspond to this range of times. So you're getting a large clustering of points here. Another natural kind of cluster of sessions are kind of short kind of duration sessions that are spread throughout the day. When people are running errands, whether it's during the daytime or the nighttime, where they plug in, need their vehicle charged quickly because they're departing very quickly for, another commuting use, right? Whatever that might be. And so you would expect those to be more uniformly distributed throughout the day in terms of start time and have shorter duration, right? So that would correspond to points along this line here, clustering below this line, okay? And so now if we take these points and we decompose them into opt-in and opt-out sessions, right? What you find is the blue here represents opt-in sessions, okay? Red represents opt-out sessions. The majority of opt-in sessions correspond to overnight, long duration charging sessions, which you can see here in terms of the marginal distribution of the session arrival time, right? It's peaking in the evening, and the marginal distribution of the session end time, which is peaking in the morning. And these opt-out sessions are correspond to these shorter duration kind of sessions that are more uniformly distributed in terms of start time throughout the day. And you see that uniform distribution of the session start and end times reflected in these marginal distributions here. Okay. So there's an important kind of implication here, right? So customers are more likely to plug in when they have flexibility and less likely to, more likely to opt in when they have flexibility and less likely to opt in when they don't have flexibility, right? So although the number of charging sessions that are opt-out is non-trivial in the order of 35%, those sessions are inflexible to begin with. There's not much flexibility they could have provided had they opted in. Assuming these baseline kind of start and end times are immutable, not impacted by the incentives that we're offering customers. So that's an important caveat. So to kind of reflect this effect more clearly, what I've plotted here in terms of these gray bars is the opt-in rate as a function of realized session slack time. Because we're comparing opt-in and opt-out sessions here, we're using realized slack time as opposed to requested slack time because opt-out sessions do not have a request, slack time request. And so what you find is, right, the opt-in rate for sessions that have very low slack time, 0 to 1 hour, is very low. So only 10% of charging sessions that have this limited slack correspond to opt-in sessions. But as slack increases, right, as flexibility increases, you see the opt-in rate increase, plateauing at around 80%, which is important, right? Because this is really where the meat is. This is the flexibility that we're trying to tap. And then decreasing slightly for longer sessions that have longer duration. We're still trying to understand what's causing this decrease. We think it may have something to do with uncertainty in the departure time that customers may have when they're plugged in for long stretches of time. But that's still an open question. I want to make one more comment about this figure here. So another kind of like benefit of these kinds of, this decomposition or clustering of opt-in and opt-out sessions is that because opt-out sessions their start times are uniformly distributed during the daytime hours, although some do occur on peak, right? Because of this uniform or this dispersion in that distribution, you'll see a kind of smearing effect. They're unlikely to all cluster during on-peak hours, okay? And actually, if we go back to one of these earlier figures here, sorry, bear with me a moment. Yes, some lag. All right. If you look at OptimizEV, right, you see that, yes, there is load happening outside of the valley, but it's roughly uniformly distributed, at least in terms of this upper decile range, as opposed to being concentrated on peak. Okay, so I'm gonna skip some of the discussion around, I'll say one thing here. Okay, this is important actually. So what I've plotted here are a number of things kind of reflecting user behavior over time. But I think the one thing I want you to focus on is the weekly opt-in rate, right, over the course of phase 2. So what we've done is for each week of phase 2, we've calculated the fraction of sessions that were opt-in, and you see that it was relatively stable across time. So there was little attrition in the sense that customers were not opting out at greater rates over the course of the pilot. There was a decrease in charging session frequency, right, when the initial lockdown occurred. which is to be expected. And there was a gradual return as the phased reopening began to occur in New York. But charging session frequency never returned to pre-pandemic levels, at least up until the end of the second phase where we were collecting data. All right, so let me just briefly close with some, I think, interesting directions for future research. One, I mean, because this was a small pilot, it wasn't an experiment in the formal sense, there's a need to expand these kinds of pilots to larger kind of randomized control trials, right? Perhaps over larger regions beyond kind of a particular service territory, because there aren't that many EVs, right, in any one region. Certain parts of California have higher densities, so that might be a reasonable candidate to use. But multi-state experiments, I think, are also reasonable. Is a question that kind of, I think that Vlad was hinting at, well, you know, are these incentives sufficient? And, you know, because our hands were tied by the utility in terms of our ability to change these rates, we were not permitted to change the rates. We were unable to learn kind of what these sensitivities were. But what we found through surveys that we conducted actually is the monetary element was perhaps less important than the perceived environmental benefit in participating in these programs. And so what we did is, and I haven't discussed those results here, but in the last leg of the pilot, we conducted a randomized control experiment where we used environmental communication to reflect or communicate to users the effect of their participation patterns on avoided greenhouse gas emissions. So that analysis is still ongoing. But it's those kinds of incentives, if you call them that, are potentially more powerful than monetary incentives. Primarily because the marginal value that any one user might bring through shifted load to the distribution network is small. The marginal value of an individual is small, but the aggregate benefit in terms of environmental impacts is potentially large. We're also, we're based on some of the learnings that we gathered through this pilot, developing more sophisticated predictive control algorithms that are also adaptive to some of these idiosyncratic charging characteristics that I described. And one thing that we're working on now is making this data set public, so that the broader academic community can use this to do their own experiments. I think what's unique about this data set in terms of residential EV charging is that we not only have plug-in times and charging profiles, but we also have unplug times, which is different from finished charging times. So large data sets like Pecan Street, while they're very granular and nice, they do not have unplugged time data, which is actually crucial if you're going to think about things like flexibility, right? So if anyone's interested in working with that data before it's made public, please reach out to me, and I'd be happy to work with you to share kind of a JSON file that has these data. If you're interested in learning more about the work that we've done as part of this pilot, there's it's actually now an archive, a preprint of summarizing these results. You can find that on my website. I'm just a minute over, but I'd be happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Eilyan. Yes, we're a bit over time, but I think it's okay if we take like 5-10 minutes for questions. So please feel free to unmute yourself and step forward with your question, comments. All right. And I think you made everything very clear to the.
Okay, well, that's good. Sometimes a good thing, right?
Yes, yes, it is. It is. Maybe just I actually had a more like a practical question. I was just curious how this project is organized, because it looks so different from the just purely academic project. But here, for example, you had this app, right, that the users could use to communicate with a distribution grid. Was Cardinal also part of this app design? Like
Yes,
application design?
yes. Just to give you a little bit of kind of background behind kind of the inception of this pilot. I mean, this started back in 2016 or 2017 through kind of collaboration with the local utility here in Tompkins County. We decided to put together a proposal to the Public Service Commission to do an experiment, a pilot like this. Over the span of 1 to 2 years, they ultimately approved it. They earmarked money for the pilot. There's several $1 million that were earmarked to not only fund our research and development, but also the infrastructure and partners that were used to deploy the charging infrastructure. So a company called Key2 Systems implemented our algorithms using their chargers. So they were also the third party that developed the user interface. We provided them with guidance on how the user interface should be structured, but there were some constraints. I think if we go back to redesign or had more freedom in terms of how that interface was designed, we probably would have opted for something different, a little more streamlined, perhaps. But
yeah. All right. Thank you. We also have 2 questions. One question from SD participant. What do you mean by non-monetary incentives?
So what I mean by so again, incentive is maybe a misleading word to use, but what specifically, one of the things that we're exploring now are mission-based communication. So when customers decide to opt, imagine we do not provide incentives, monetary incentives for customers to delay, right? But instead just give them the choice to opt in or opt out, providing some deadline. What you can do is you can tell them the impact of their decisions on either the greenhouse gas emissions they avoided by participating in the pilot, or the greenhouse gas emissions they could have avoided had they not opted out. So essentially conveying to them what their potential impact on environmental impacts are through their decisions, which can be more powerful actually than these small monetary incentives. So incentive is maybe a misleading word. Communication perhaps is more precise.
This is very, very clear. And we also have a question from did you evaluate the online algorithm performance in hindsight as well?
That's a good question. So in terms of the optimization objective, this kind of sum of squares, no. But ultimately our goal was to kind of do valley filling, fill the valley. And what you can see from the kind of those statistical, the empirical distributions that I plotted over load patterns, on a large majority of the days, the peak load was below kind of the baseline peak. But that's a good question. I think we should do that analysis, actually. Now that you ask it, I think that is something that we'll study or maybe include in as part of our analysis. Thank you.
Yeah. We also have a question about long-term impacts of the study. So Anna Heide asks, is there any calculation whether the long-term benefits for the utility would make up for the increase in cost in terms of communication and reduced tariffs?
So that's a fantastic question. We haven't kind of done that analysis completely yet, partly because it's to really kind of do a correct kind of assessment along these lines. You need good models that capture kind of the spatial emergence or distribution of EVs in your network, right? Like if you have, you could have 10 EVs, but having them uniformly distributed across your network is very different from having them concentrated under a single transformer. And so the avoided costs that you can achieve through these kinds of coordination mechanisms depends heavily on the spatial distribution.
That's actually also my question, because the motivation was that there was a 12 kilowatt transformer at the beginning that serves like several houses, right?
25 kilowatts, yes.
35, yes. And then does this optimized coordination of E allows to postpone its upgrade to 75?
Yeah, actually, so that 16% number that I provided, that was chosen for a specific reason. It was kind of implicitly determined by what the kind of aggregate transformer capacity would have been for that, that collection of households. So yes, there would have, had you not coordinated charging, at least under unmanaged charging, you would have required an upgrade of 1 to 2 transformers.
That's very impressive. It's very impressive. We also have a question from user SD. Sorry, I don't know what the abbreviation stands for. Do you use penalties for opting out in between?
That's a really good question. We wanted to use penalties, okay, to discourage that kind of behavior, but there are 2 reasons that, one main reason that we decided not. Well, okay, there are 2 reasons. One, the utility, our utility partner did not want to impose a penalty on early departures, in part because it makes the accounting process more difficult at the end of the month. But 2, because if a customer does encounter an emergency that requires them to depart sooner than their stated departure time, then you don't want to necessarily penalize them for doing that. So we did not, but that's something reasonable to do.
Yeah, it also makes sense to me. Like it might discourage people to engage in the program if the program is too strict on the emergency.
Yeah, I mean, and also looking at the data, we had very few early departures. I mean, we do have them, but when they occur, they don't appear to be strategic early departures, right? Where customers are. This is actually a question that we've explored in another paper. Where if you have these kind of incentives to delay, right, and then you're using kind of an online scheduling algorithm that may be driven in part by uncertainty in other users' preferences, or which are happening kind of stochastically, then it may happen that some users get their energy well before their deadline, and that might be systematic, right? So customers over time might learn that they could request longer deadlines, but still that are in excess of their true deadline, but still get their energy before their true deadline with high probability, right? We did not, that kind of strategic behavior or lack of incentive compatibility did not appear to manifest itself in data. But it's an very interesting theoretical question, actually, to ask when it comes to the design of these kinds of programs.
All right. Looks like we ran out of questions. I think we had a very good discussion. Yeah, thank you, Eilyan, again for this presentation. So it was a great talk. And yes, just time to say goodbye.
Okay, well, it was my pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.